Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Kimberly Fine with Corporate Counsel Business Journal. We are thrilled to be working with our partner H5 to present today's webcast, New Rules, New Tools, AI, and Compliance. Our distinguished speakers are Tamia Moore, Business Risk and Control Officer, Commercial Bank, Wells Fargo, Kimberly Pack, Associate General Counsel, Compliance, Anheuser-Busch, Alex Lakatos, Partner, Mayer Brown, Eric Pender, Engagement Manager, H5, Doug Austin, Editor, eDiscovery Today. We encourage you all to ask questions, download materials, as well as fill out the survey with your feedback at the end. All can be found at the icons, at the buttons on the bottom of your screen. Today's webcast is CLE eligible. Please be sure to answer all the pop-up check-ins and enter your state and bar number in the survey. All states will be applied to after the webcast, and certificates will be distributed once the state approves. CLE credit is only available for the live day, not on demand. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for attending, and it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Doug.
Thanks, Kim, and welcome everybody. We're excited to be here to talk to you about AI and compliance. As Kim mentioned, we do love questions, so if you have questions for us, please put them into the Q&A, and we will try to address as many of your questions as we can. So with that said, we'll start off with the agenda. Our panel of experts will discuss the compliance challenges that organizations are facing today, several AI use cases for those compliance challenges, some of the technical approaches and methods for data classification, how you set expectations within your organization for the deployment of AI technology, and finally, how you keep an AI solution compliant and what you do to keep from introducing bias into the AI model. So Kim already briefly introduced us. We'll get into a little more introduction here. I'll go first. I'm Doug Austin, editor of eDiscovery Today, which is a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, and data privacy trends, best practices, and case law. I've been writing a daily blog for over 10 years, and I've been providing legal technology and eDiscovery consulting services for over 30 years. I'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves. So Tamia, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. By way of quick introduction, I'm based in Washington, D.C., began my career in the transactional tax space, but evolved or kind of pivoted into risk and compliance about 10 years ago. Broadly, I've gotten to work compliance from a lot of different angles, be it program implementation, policy development, control testing, issue remediation, and actually my favorite, which is operationalizing regs. As a result, I can look at compliance in a lot of different directions, which has been really valuable to me in my career. Very happy to be here today and looking forward to a great discussion.
Great, thanks, Tamia. Kimberly, would you like to go next?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Kimberly Pack. Happy to join you today. So I've been with Anheuser-Busch now, based in St. Louis since July 2020. So shout out to everyone who started a new job during the pandemic. Prior to joining Anheuser-Busch, I was at Prudential, really focused on compliance controls for about 6 years. And before that, GC at a financial firm in Fargo, North Dakota.
Great. Thanks, Kimberly. Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Doug. I've been working at various large law firms for the last 25 years, and I'm currently at Mayer Brown, where I've been for about 15 years as a partner. I'm mostly a litigator, and I mostly specialize in what I might summarize as big banks in big trouble and investigations for financial institutions. Increasingly, those issues touch on technology and artificial intelligence, so that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And Eric, would you like to go last?
Thanks, Doug. My name is Eric Pender. I'm a engagement manager at H5 and have spent my career in the both the eDiscovery and the information governance space, leveraging AI models and linguistic models to help clients realize the data challenges and solve the data challenges that they're confronted with, whether it's in litigation, internal investigations, compliance, data privacy. So,
great, thanks everybody. So let's get into it. Well, actually, first, Kim has already mentioned the accreditation facts and what you need to do to get CLE credit. So this slide has already been covered. And of course, as always, any ideas expressed by us here today are our own, not those of our organizations, clients, or partners. So please keep that in mind during these discussions. So with that said, now let's get into it. And when it comes to compliance challenges that organizations are having to address these days, let's be honest, if they didn't exist, we wouldn't be here talking about it. So here, you see on this slide, are several of the compliance challenges organizations are faced with. So let's see what challenges our panelists have seen with regard to compliance obligations within organizations. So Tamia, working in the financial sector, I'm sure you've seen plenty of regulatory oversight. How has that oversight increased the compliance obligations for financial institutions?
Yeah, lots of oversight. And I think we have to step back on root cause to really look at the evolution of the industry in the past couple of decades, from primarily like local and regional financial institutions into these kind of nationwide mega financial institutions. So with that growth and with that increase in your product offering, kind of end to end, whatever a consumer wants or a business wants, naturally that increases your compliance obligations. So I think what we're seeing more than just kind of simply an increase in compliance obligations is this new acknowledgement from financial institutions that they really need to do the work to realize it on their own, or sometimes learn the hard way, you know, from a regulator coming in and letting them know the critical importance of a well-controlled compliance environment and the ability to meaningfully measure and report out on that state of compliance. You'd rather figure it out yourself and work on it as opposed to someone on the outside coming in and saying, hey, we have a problem here. And then to step beyond that, I think the advent of these new industries and fintech and technology like AI, the regulators are moving from this reactive mode into a more proactive mode. And an example of that in AI is, you know, within the past month, 5 regulators sent a request for information to financial institutions asking, 1, how they're currently leveraging AI, but 2, more importantly, what are the risks and controls that you have in place to make sure that the AI is not introducing new risks, biases, any other problems. So it's a really unique space, but I think you can look at it as an opportunity, right? If for financial institutions to respond to regulators, maybe you can control the narrative on how they start to look at this risk type and how they start to decide how they're going to assess the effectiveness of implementation and use. Or you can kind of shriek back and say, I don't want to help, I don't want to participate, I don't know where this is going. And to anyone outside of the financial space, right, this RFI is very likely coming your way as well. So it's not industry specific. I think regulators are really looking to be more proactive and figure out how to identify and assess issues, because ultimately they're concerned about the consumer, which all of our companies are and should be as well, but that doesn't mean that mistakes don't happen.
Oh, that makes sense. And certainly it doesn't surprise me that we're seeing so much more attention by the regulatory agencies. So another challenge certainly is data. And Eric, you know, you talked about being involved in e-discovery, InfoGov. How has the growth in data volumes and variety of data sources created more compliance challenges for organizations?
Yeah, you know, I think the risk frontier for compliance is sort of like the universe, right? And then it's constantly expanding. You know, you have this variety of data sources that I think is really pushing out the risk frontier. And then you have the increase in data volumes, which almost always means that your risk calculation is greater, right? I mean, I think about risk in that impact times likelihood model. And I think the increased data volumes, it just maximizes that calculation. But I think you also can't forget about access points, right? Where are you accessing the data from? It used to be that I just accessed business documents on my computer. Now I access them on a work computer, on a cell phone. Sometimes it's on my iPad. Occasionally it would be on a personal computer. I've had clients that have required that I use one of their boxes when I'm engaged on their work. So the access points have increased so much as well. And I think finally, we also need to consider the organizational life cycle of the data. How long does data live in an organization? What are the various transformations that are applied to the data? I think all of those things are increasing the compliance challenges for organizations.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Certainly another challenge is data privacy. And so Kimberly, certainly with GDPR, CCPA, other privacy laws having either gone into effect or at least having been enacted, how the increased privacy compliance requirements impacted organizations like Anheuser-Busch.
Yeah, so Anheuser-Busch and our parent company, AB InBev, we're the largest beer company in the world. And so what that means for us is that there are a zillion employees, there's a zillion breweries and operations in all the major markets globally. And so it's a huge impact. So there's, we want to be compliant. And as things change and they have differences, so I'll focus on the US right now. This year, it was like over 20 different states introduced privacy laws. They aren't the same. No one's using a model bill, right? There's no federal law that's happening at this time. And then they're bifurcated. Some are only talking about notice. Some are talking about access. Some are even states are starting to even introduce regulations around artificial intelligence itself as a separate thing. And so for us, it's our approach. So we are set up with a global digital ethics team, and then we have local folks, so I'm focused on the US, who are hyper localized to really try to support our business teams who are trying to keep pace, remain profitable in the crazy times that we find ourselves in COVID. And so that's one of the biggest effects is wanting to be compliant, not knowing what the laws mean sometimes because they are vague, they are poorly written, they pass and they're going to have regulations coming out. And just, as the legal and compliance team, just really stand on top of it and having really good strategic relationships with our businesses so that we can, let them know what's coming down the pipe. But more importantly, we understand what they're trying to do in a year, in 3 years. These things are really important for us as some of these laws are not coming into effect until 2023. So CPRA and the Virginia bill. So it's a challenge, but I think we have a great team and the company is really focused on it. And so I'm really hopeful that we'll continue to do a good job for the company.
Yeah, it's a continually changing landscape for sure. And, the targets are changing in terms of what you're needing to accomplish. So another challenge, of course, is fraud. And Alex, we've seen increased challenges associated with theft and fraud within organizations. So how have you seen those challenges impact organizations from a compliance standpoint?
Yeah, so I think you're raising an excellent question there, and I think what we're seeing right now for organizations is really when it comes to fraud, when it comes to theft, when it comes to this type of attack and misconduct, a perfect storm, that is having an effect. What we're seeing is three things really: increased fraud, and a lot of that is due to the COVID-19 situation with, at least for financial institutions and for some others, fraud around the Paycheck Protection Program, around unemployment insurance, around healthcare scams, around, imposter scams and identity frauds. And these are problems for institutions that can, hurt their reputation, that can hurt their customer relationships, and that are made, especially difficult because there's some uncertainty as to the full extent and exact parameters of what institutions are required to do to prevent. So that's sort of the first of the three things, is the increase in the fraud. The second thing we're seeing, and I won't go into this in depth because I think really Tamia, talked about this, but we are seeing, an increase in regulatory pressures and regulatory issues at the same time for regulated financial institutions that have to file suspicious activity reports, when, for example, they suspect that one of their customers is involved in committing a fraud or that they have been a victim themselves of a fraud, there's increased pressure from the regulators to provide better quality, whereas at the same time, there's an incentive, if you miss something and you don't file, there could be, people could look badly on that. There's incentives to file a lot. So that's the second thing we're seeing. And then the third thing we're seeing is increased resources challenges in the current environment. The lines of business being very focused on business challenges, less focused maybe on preventing fraud, a certain number of people who are out on sick leave, people who are away from their desks and aren't engaged in the way that they usually are. We're seeing some instances where ongoing investigations of fraud may be getting less attention as new problems emerge. And so in terms of how this affects organizations, you have these three problems. And what we're seeing is organizations deal with this in a couple of ways. One is better technology, and that's some of what we're here to talk about today, which is that the organizations are really working to augment legacy systems with artificial intelligence and advanced detection techniques. Those things take time, and that can be a challenge. We're seeing a lot of experimentation with that. And then the second thing we're seeing in terms of how organizations are affected and actually effective is better coordination within the organization. And we see organizational silos as being one of the biggest challenges when it comes to compliance and when it comes to fighting fraud. And it's important to have a consistent approach across the business and a coordinated approach. And what we're seeing and what we like to see in any event is coordination across the teams that protect the institution, be that cyber IT security, financial crimes, regulatory reporting. So that's sort of what I would say about how organizations are being affected by fraud and how they're dealing with it.
Yeah, no, those are great points. So to me, in this section, I'll give the last question to you. With compliance obligations routinely changing, what have been the challenges for creating awareness of those changes within large organizations like yours?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think these challenges can show up a number of different ways. And, interestingly, the challenges can vary by reg source, right? And so we have some regs that have broad applicability across an organization. And so to piggyback on Alex's point, right, if you need to touch all of your business-facing team members in a large organization, how do you efficiently and effectively get that information to them, and not just the regulatory change, but what it means on how they function day to day, right? And in other kind of more niche regulatory areas, there may just be a dearth of subject matter expertise. My mom routinely, when people ask her what I do, she calls me a tax nerd and laughs. But there aren't a lot of people, right, that gravitated toward tax the way that I do. And so when you have issues that, have always been present for financial institutions or a lot of large organizations, and then a couple of years ago, you have the introduction of FATCA, you're looking for people that can not only ingest the voluminous information, but also relate it to business practices, identify where it has impact. And so that dearth of subject matter expertise can be a problem. I think one solution, in addition to utilizing AI tools, is centralization, right? But what sometimes I've seen or heard happen in organizations becomes forum shopping. So you have two experts in an organization, and they're not aligned or necessarily on the same page, especially with regulations that have room for interpretation. Some of them are written and it's like, this is what you do, there's nothing else to do, this is how you comply, next. There are others where organizations look at their risk appetite and say, this isn't really clear, but this is a stance that we want to take, right? And so you really want business folks to not be in a position to be able to forum shop across subject matter experts sitting in different places within an organization, because you can have the same customer serviced by different groups within your organization, seeing different outcomes. And I can tell you, they do not like it. They notice, they don't like it. And so that's, can potentially be a big issue. The other thing is business team members or kind of customer facing team members they're moving at the pace of business. And so you also have to think about, in these large organizations, how to not hamper their ability to do their job, sell their products, make their metrics, right? But still understand all of the things that they have to factor into how they're doing what they're doing. So I think that's another big challenge that people face, or just a general reticence of business team members to pause and say, let me make sure I'm doing this in alignment with the current state of our compliance obligations. And a lot of times, generic training dealt out to everybody isn't enough. So it can be an issue.
Yes, indeed. So we certainly have talked plenty about challenges and problems. Thanks to Mia for that. And when it comes to nerds, I resemble that remark. So I'll just kind of throw that out there. So let's talk about, how we address these challenges and how AI can help. As you can see on this slide, there are at least 12 AI use cases and probably more for compliance today. So let's talk about them. And I'll start with Kimberly. So Kimberly, how can AI be used to help ensure compliance with policies? And how can it be used for process improvement overall?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're super proud of at AB InBev and Anheuser-Busch is our proprietary IA system, data analytics system that we call BrewRight, which was built really focused on foreign corrupt practice compliance. And it really takes about 15 different dashboards from our different internal systems to give us a view of what's going on. And we use that data, again, for FCPA compliance. We use it for investigations management. We use it for alcohol beverage law compliance. And actually the performance of key accounting controls as well. And so it really gives us a really great view. And since it started, it's a learning machine. And so it's helpful because it's identifying patterns. So it helps us see these outliers. And what it positions us to do, when you think of FCPA, which isn't my expertise, but back in the day, someone would take a briefcase of cash somewhere, right, and give it to some government official. That's not how these things are done now, right? So there's these slush funds that are created. There's these payments that are made that are inappropriate, either from the company themselves or more likely from some third party. And so then using this tool to be able to monitor the transactions of third parties that we're connected to look out for these kind of payments is really a big deal. And then back home, just for something that's not even just FCPA related, is, just general employees' credit card abuse, right? Because we're in those systems, we can even identify those kind of things, and which brings back some cost savings back to the company, right? If we're able to see these things in a way that we can be detective about it and not just wait for some whistleblower or hotline call where we are actively looking for outlier behavior, strange patterns or new activity. And so because as companies, we have this data. And so the question is, how are we using it? And artificial intelligence is a great way for us to start being able to identify and mitigate some risks that we have. So that's how we're using it. It's a super great technology. In fact, we have the BrewRight Consortium where we're also collaborating with other companies so we can collaborate about better solutions, compliance solutions.
Great. And we have a question from the audience asking about the tool that you're using. And it's called BrewRight, but it's one that Anheuser-Busch built internally.
It's in-house built, yep. So it's not off the shelf. So that's the only tool today that I'll name because it's ours.
Right. There you go. And we'll certainly talk here in a little bit about build versus buy considerations. So Alex, have you seen organizations leverage AI to reduce the burden to address things like alerts?
Yeah, actually, that's a fantastic use case for AI. And there's some things to think about when you there's a few ways to use AI to reduce the burden from alerts. And the first is, tuning the AI itself and getting the AI to be smarter about what your organization is going to alert on. Right? I mean, if you set something to be too sensitive, you're going to be drowned in alerts. You can't make sense of them. You can't get to them all. You set it in the other direction. You only get the instances of the really, really bad conduct. So AI, because it is a learning tool, can be smarter about which alerts get triggered. Here's the thing. the bad guys know this. The people who want to get past your compliance systems, particularly if you're a financial institution, they have some ideas, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are pretty sophisticated about how to use your AI against you. And what do I mean by that? Well, some of you who are of my vintage may remember the movie Airplane, and there's a scene in Airplane where a line of terrorists is going through the metal detector, right? And all of them are carrying bazookas and guns and things like that. When your threats look obvious, and many, if your AI is learning as it goes along what a threat looks like, your AI is going to learn, okay, I know what a terrorist looks like. They're very easy to spot. They carry guns and bombs, and they're very blatant. And then something more subtle will get by it. And so what people will actually do is repeatedly attack an organization that is obvious in the hopes of tuning your AI to only look for the obvious stuff. And so if you periodically are retuning your alerts based on your AI, and you notice an anomaly, you notice all of a sudden, look, we're being attacked in a very particular, very blatant way, you need to stop and try to figure out, is there really more of this thing going on, or is it sort of a false flag operation meant to distract my AI? The second thing that I would note is the other thing organizations are doing is that they are actually at a point where they are replacing certain human functions with AI. And I just described an instance where AI needs humans to oversee it. On terms of sort of line-level work in reviewing simple alerts, a number of big organizations have discovered that their AI can do a better job. And, you know, there's some challenges around that, a variety of them. One of them is to get the regulators comfortable. And one thing, and it varies from regulator to regulator, the degree of sophistication, but one thing I have found that regulators really like to see is a theory, right? AI doesn't work on a theory. AI just works on a correlation. AI might say, if Alex wears red pants, then my statistics show me that Alex is more likely to speed down the highway. And it doesn't really care about the why, what's the theory behind that. Regulators get more comfortable with a little bit of theory behind it. I've interviewed people with red pants, and people who are bold enough to wear red pants say that they also like to drive boldly, so there's a reason for it. That type of thing makes regulators a little more comfortable, but it's not really what AI is built to do. So there's some work there in when you are saying, look, we're going to have a machine look at these alerts rather than humans, understanding, you know, do the numbers show it works better? And if so, can we come up with a theory as to why that's true and explain it? So that's what I would observe about that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. And anytime you use the movie Airplane as an analogy, that works for me. So, so Eric, you know, I asked you earlier about InfoGov and records retention challenges. Are you seeing AI being used to help organizations better manage and understand their document collections?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not just about understanding what data the organization has. That's really just step one. Step two, in most cases, is taking some sort of action on the data. Maybe it's keeping it, maybe it's deleting it. But, you know, we see this a lot with records retention, and records retention programs can be very complex. There's just so many stakeholders, right? You have records management, you have compliance, you have legal, maybe you have the privacy office, maybe the privacy office rolls up to legal, you have your IT folks. And I think it's really important to approach this from a program management standpoint and look at it through a holistic lens. You know, some of the other panelists mentioned this. I think it's really important to have a consistent review. You need to do an audit, not just of whether your model is performing, but also you need to talk with your key stakeholders to make sure that your direction is still correct, right? If the regulations have changed or the business has changed, that can affect the performance of the model, and the model hasn't really done anything different, right? Goes back to what Alex was mentioning with the theory, right? The theory has changed. I think it's really important to conduct this rigorous testing. You want to be diligent about your memorialization of the decision points and your testing results. Obviously, that supports the defensibility of these tools and the processes in case they're ever called into question. And it's really important to have the right expertise at the table as well, not only from a model building standpoint, but also from a statistical standpoint, to understand how we test this in a rigorous way that is defensible. And finally, I would just say, I think we're seeing a lot of demand to automate processes, sort of from the back end to fulfill compliance requirements. It's not just about data classification and retention anymore. I think there's just a lot of processes. There's sort of a new dawn, if you will, for AI, and I think folks are really starting to explore some of these additional use cases.
Yep, absolutely, as evidenced by what we're talking about here today, Eric. So that's a great point. So Tamia, you talked about regulatory challenges earlier. Can you talk a bit about how you think AI can be leveraged to help organizations meet those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would want to tie back to what I talked about the need to be able to illustrate in some meaningful metric the state of compliance of your program against whatever reg that you have at issue at any point in time, and that potential dearth of subject matter expertise. So I think a great place that I would like to see AI leveraged is in internal testing. So this is something that can happen at every line of defense, right? Instead of low-hanging fruit kind of testing, is this box empty and this box full, those sort of if-then statements on data that you're producing to make sure that it's correct. Not only could you increase your sample sizing, instead of doing periodic testing, you could have a live monitoring environment, and that would enable you to spot and remediate issues in real time, as opposed to catching them a year later and trying to figure out how to make adjustments accordingly. So, in the first line of defense, the QA and QC that operational team members are performing on their functions. In the independent line of defense, our testing and validation teams, and how they come in and give that independent oversight to say, do you have sufficient controls? Are they working? And then audit, obviously, could leverage the same technology. And this is going to solve for being able to stratify data to look at high-risk populations as opposed to doing random statistical sampling, but also free up the subject matter experts that you do have to look at things that are beyond machine learning, that require some intuition, that are judgment-based decisions or determinations, or maybe unique situations where you had carved out an exception for a client or a product. And so I think that's a huge area where not only you could use your human capital in its most effective manner, you could still do the testing and have an understanding of how effective your operations and sort of decision-making is happening via systems or manual processes, which, let's be honest, a lot of us are still there and the risk is high. Introducing that AI technology, I think, would make a huge difference, so that, again, we're not having outsiders coming in and saying, knock, knock, this isn't quite right. We're figuring it out ourselves, and we're remediating it accordingly and in real time. So I think that's a great place to look at your organization and think about ways to leverage AI.
That's great advice. So Kimberly, we've already talked about several ways to leverage AI. What are some of the other ways that you've seen AI being used to address compliance challenges within organizations?
I think one that's like a little random but interesting is, for some companies that have drivers, there are a lot of Department of Transportation regulations. And so there is technology where they are in the trucks. They are using facial recognition to identify distracted driving, cell phone usage, inappropriate cell phone usage, because there are strict laws about not using handheld devices while you're operating those vehicles. That's one. For us, we use some technology around training where people are doing some know-how videos. So it's technology where they are videoing how to do it right. When we're manufacturing, we're having big machines. It can be dangerous. So for safety, and also to be able to carry on know-how, this technology is allowing us to show people how to do the job, not just reading some manual that might not be up to date. And then it's also automating the SOP process for how to do the thing. And then it's also given us more seamless language translation as well. So that's so it's operational, but it's also, being compliant and supporting our teams doing business. I think some IA uses that's also for compliance is also some automatic data classifications where the machine learning, the technology is in the background and people are creating Microsoft documents and things like that. And this technology is in the background classifying it. So somebody types in a social security number, it's automatically classifying it as strictly confidential, which is helpful, or if it's internal only. So it's really getting smart and giving this different classifications that's automatic. So we're not even relying on employees to remember to click a button. It's learning what's sensitive, what's not sensitive, and giving it a classification. In the privacy front, we're using technology that's helping us to identify where personal information is. So it's scrubbing, it's going in through structured and unstructured data, and helping us to know where it is. I mean, ideally, it would be in these centers that we'd want them to be in. However, we have lots of employees, right? And so they might be hanging out there in an Excel file, something like that. And so this tool being able to go out and identify these things is going to be really helpful for us. And also to be compliant with, data subject requests. These new laws are giving individuals the right to ask for what we have, to correct it. And so you need to know that it's there. If they want a deletion, can you really delete anything if you don't know exactly where all the information is? And so really trying to be compliant and responsive to our consumers when they do make such requests. So that tool is really helpful there. I think another tool in the HR space, I think HR folks are really using a lot of artificial intelligence to identify candidates, to enhance the candidate experience. And that's where it gets a little tricky and makes me like you really dive in there, because that's where, some bias, depending on what's being used and how decisions are being made, is a hot area, and one that, control functions are really looking at, and we're really monitoring how our teams are trying to use it. So we continue to not reinforce any bias or any discrimination and things like that. I think that was about was covered right now. Yeah, I think that's good, right?
That's certainly plenty of them. So those are some great ones. Alex, when you and I discussed this session beforehand, you stated you thought we're seeing a renaissance for AI use. So what factors do you think have caused this renaissance?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that that's the case. And I think there are three key things that lead to it. One is faster computing. There's a tremendous amount of data to crunch, and the more sophisticated the algorithm, the more you need that. And that's a trend I think we're going to see continuing. I think people think quantum computing is on the way. The second thing is better algorithms. So the AI itself is getting more sophisticated than it used to be. And the last thing, and this is something I think Eric and a number and Kimberly and actually everyone really touched on, is that there's more data, right? Data is the fuel that AI needs. It learns best when it has a lot of data. Often it needs structured, meaning labeled data, but not always. But regardless, we are seeing tremendously greater amounts of data. And a lot of people are familiar with what's called Moore's Law, which is the not a law, but that's what it's called. It's the concept that computing power seems to double every X number of months. And that is true. But we see the same thing with data. The quantity of data in the world, probably going back several hundred years, regularly doubles every, I think, 12 to 18 months. You see a regular doubling of it. And so, it's just tremendous amounts of that are going to, feed the AI. And that's why I think we are having a renaissance of it now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes perfect sense. The more computing power, more data, more data to feed the AI engine. So certainly makes sense. So let's move on to the actual technical nuts and bolts a little bit of how AI-related technologies can be leveraged to support these use cases we just talked about and address the challenges. So Eric, we've discussed the why AI, and we've discussed the what AI is being used for. Can you briefly talk a little bit about the how in terms of methods and approaches used to actually classify data within organizations?
Yeah, I think the how is probably an hour-long call unto itself. And there's really there's a wide variety, right? There's a wide variety of approaches. And I think that's why it's really important to have a holistic program management style approach to this, because there's so many different ways that you can approach a lot of these problems. Yeah, I'll talk about two. First, you have machine learning models. You have supervised and unsupervised models. Alex sort of touched on this. Supervised models ingest data that's already been categorized, so they're really great for predictions and making predictive models. And then you have unsupervised models, which intake unlabeled, uncategorized information. There's a lot of use cases for these as well. They're really good for data pattern and structure recognition. We talked about records retention before. A lot of people think about that as a structured problem, and in a lot of ways it is. But at the very front end of that, to do some unstructured analysis and unsupervised modeling to see how the data is grouping itself can be super powerful. The second part that I wanted to talk about is linguistic modeling. Linguistic modeling seeks to model and leverage an understanding of how your organization talks. And so it involves models that take deep expertise on lexicon, on grammar, on semantics, on pragmatics, on syntax, sometimes combines that with pattern recognition and regular expressions. And, I think what we see with machine learning models is they're really good at binary decisions, right? I'll go back to the example that Alex used from Airplane. They're really good at identifying the terrorists coming in, right? Those are really clear examples. But machine learning models, in a lot of cases, are not always as great at what we sort of refer to as the messy middle. And I think there's a lot of focus these days on solving textual problems like it's a math problem. But I think we also want to think about how do we solve these and think about these from a language standpoint. And, I had a healthcare client a couple years back that had an entire glossary of terminology that was many pages long that was used by the company, right? Sometimes machine learning models can do well with that, but sometimes they don't. And so linguistic modeling can really serve as a powerful backstop to that. And I think you want to look at how compliance requirements have changed over time, and does the language and linguistic modeling help to resolve some of those issues that we see there. But ultimately, I think this comes down to the question of, what action do you want to take on your data, and what version of modeling is going to be best suited to get you there?
That makes perfect sense. And obviously, Eric's touched on a couple of these, and we have 2 or 3 others listed. And you're going to be hearing a lot more about various approaches, as we progress over time. So certainly expect more of that. We do have a couple of great additional questions. We're going to try to briefly get through most of the rest of the content and save a little time at the end for those questions. So thanks for sending them. So let's talk a little bit about actually deploying the AI. And when it comes to deploying it, there's a lot more to it than just downloading and running an install executable. It's important to properly evaluate the technology, and like any other solution or an organization implements, it can't succeed without buy-in from key people within the organization. So, Kimberly, I'm sure that deploying AI mechanisms within an organization the size of Anheuser-Busch can be challenging. What do organizations need to do to facilitate that deployment, and what should they do to ensure that they're fully vetting the technology they're considering?
Yeah, so I think it starts, with these control functions, us, one, being really aligned as strategic business partners with the business, one, so we can know that things are going on, right? And then 2, having well-communicated, bought-in workflows for how these things happen. So it goes from, hey, we're thinking about using this, and then they're pulling us in right away, right? What are these use cases? Maybe we are able to go to the demo meetings together. And some, because we're not just worried about contracts, right? We really want to make sure that we understand what these tools are, how we're looking to use it, and to really, evaluate, the appropriateness for our business. And so I would start there. And then from there, we have a workflow. And most companies have these these impact assessments where it's, it's a workflow. We use a tool for that. And so it kicks off and, there's opportunities for our in-house people to input things right in, and also the third party, if that's where the tool is coming from, and really evaluating it, taking the time to go through and ask the specific questions, upload the things. And that's really important. And then to see and understand, through the life of it, so you can deploy it. But, I think one of the things that's really interesting is, these companies can do all kinds of stuff. They have lots of information. Some things I'm restricting my businesses from using. Yes, they can offer us the world. We will not be using the world of things that they are offering us. And then having controls in place to say, that there are stop gates. So someone's not next year, activating a feature that we restricted and things like that. And so also just having like the continuing monitoring of things. And how do you do that through a third party? Are we talking about certifications? Are we checking in? And whose responsibility is that, right? So is that legal and compliance may not be doing that. So how are we building in that the business has these routines in place where they are making sure that, things are operating as they should, as they're expected, that, the outcomes aren't problematic for us. And so how do we stay close but still be able to be lawyers and compliance officers? And so it's really interesting, but deciding that routine. So I literally tell people what they need to do. I put things on my calendar. I will be checking back in 6 months. I'll be checking back in 3 months. And this is what the output will be to see if it's working. And so really putting those controls in. So it's not a one point in time kind of thing. So making sure that you have it set in place for yourself as the control function, and also with your business, how we're really staying close to this technology so we actually know what's going on and that it continues to be appropriate for us.
Right. So certainly Kimberly's talked about a lot of the things that have to be done for deployment. So Eric, from a standpoint of expectations, what expectations should organizations be setting with regards to how long it actually takes to get AI algorithms fully up and running and used as intended?
Yeah, I think it's really important for folks to be patient. I think people who are new to AI sometimes have this perception that they're going to buy AI and they're going to plug it in and it just works. And you really have to take time to train the models. Especially if you're talking about structured algorithms and you need to input classified data, you probably need to classify that, and take the time to build out that data set. So that takes time. I think senior leadership buy-in is so important. Without that, programs, because there's so many folks who are involved, there's so many stakeholders, that without senior leadership buy-in, a lot of programs are kind of doomed to fail, I think. I think it's really important to retrain and vet your models on a consistent cadence. That's a really important ongoing step. And it's not just about using AI, but it's really about the need to be able to explain AI with a variety of audiences. Maybe that's a court, maybe that's a regulator, it could be internal stakeholders, but it's execution and articulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly we'll get into some of that monitoring in the final slide here. But first, to me, we talked about build versus buy a bit. What should organizations consider when evaluating whether to build or buy AI mechanisms to support their compliance activities?
Yeah, and I'm just going to throw out some factors because this is something that organizations struggle with all the time, and you're not always going to have a clear, comfortable answer. You're not always going to do your evaluation and say, yes, buy, comfortable, yes, build, comfortable. And so I don't want to give this false sense of kind of clarity and confidence in making this determination, but instead focus on some things to consider. And so I would say, implementing AI is change management, right? And so first, think about your organization and the culture and how well your employees or impacted team members receive change. And sometimes if you are developing that change internally, if they're at the table, if they have a voice, if they feel like they're a meaningful part of it, it's a lot easier than if you just have some cowboy vendor come in and say, we have the answer to your problems, here it is, just do what we say, right? So, I mean, always, and this goes back to my M&A days, there were transactions that looked amazing on paper. And once you got the people together and once you got the organizations together, they were like, yeah, no. And immediately you're trying to unravel that, that transaction because it was a culture issue. So on the buy side, I would say really look at their ability to meet your needs up front. And Eric touched on this a little bit because not everything is plug and play, but also is it something that is a straightforward reg that doesn't have a lot of nuances, might not have business decisioning or, institutional risk appetite built into it? Or is it something that needs all of that? What's the degree of customization that you have to do to that product? Because a lot of these vendors are like, I'm going to build this for the tech industry. I'm going to build this for the financial industry. I'm going to build this for whatever industry. And that doesn't mean that as it is, it actually works for how you function. And so what I've heard about is companies buying technology and instead of really getting value add, teaching that vendor how to stand up their product in a way that they can sell it to all their competitors, actually plug and play, right? So you're paying somebody else to help them help other people while you're really still just doing the work yourself. So I think those are a lot of important things to really think about. And on the build side, do you possess sufficient subject matter expertise to build BRDs that are going to allow you to develop a product that is going to be able to be stood up and work, and leaders not feel like you wasted money or time or whatever internal resources were associated with it. And the other thing that I've seen, and there are different dynamics in companies, are your technology partners willing to take on the challenge, right? So you have subject matter experts, they build amazing BRDs, and you're like, this is exactly what we need. This is going to cover everything that pops up for us. And technology is like, ooh, that's a lot, right? And so if you don't have internal teams that are willing to take on the challenges or are excited about or willing to lean in and devote resources to the work, then, build might not be the right thing for you. So these are just examples for consideration, but I think most importantly, fully vet both options so that when you take whatever path that you take, whether it's a smooth ride or a bumpy ride, you feel comfortable with the decision that you made.
That's great advice. So certainly one of the last things you have to consider is that AI solutions, as we've already talked about, aren't a set it and forget it type of technology. Steps have to be taken to keep the algorithms compliant and avoiding bias. And if you want an example of that, I think some of you out there maybe remember the Tay experiment in 2016 when Microsoft released Tay, which was an AI chatbot for Twitter. The company described it as an experiment in conversational understanding. It was designed to learn to engage people through casual and playful conversation, resembling how a teen might speak. But it took less than 24 hours for Twitter users and internet trolls to tweet Tay with various misogynistic and racist remarks for Tay to start repeating those sentiments back to other Twitter users, eventually unprompted. And Microsoft was forced to shut it down within literally 24 hours. So that's how quickly an AI model can go astray with enough of the wrong input, even for one of the biggest companies in the world. So Alex, very quickly here, because we just got a few minutes left, what approaches have you seen used to keep AI algorithms running effectively and minimizing the potential for bias?
Well, thanks. That's a great question. So we should start with, and I'll be brief about this. What do we mean when we say bias? I think everyone has the understanding, and this is a correct understanding of bias as not making discriminatory decisions that disadvantage protected classes, women, minorities, immigrants, that sort of thing. But fundamentally, when we think about what bias is, really bias is using small amounts of information to make generalizations a lot of the time, and it's about making wrong decisions based on those generalizations. And so I would encourage people to use the tools and the thinking about bias in anything that AI does. If AI is picking stocks, you don't want AI to be biased against growth stocks, right? You want it to be making a decision in an intelligent way that doesn't have biases. In figuring out how to deal with biases, I think it's a little bit important to have some understanding of where AI picks up biases, how that happens. And broadly speaking, I think there are sort of two places. One is the training data, right? We talked earlier, I think Eric in particular talked earlier about the idea, I talked a little bit about the idea that we teach AI, and the way, the way that we teach it is we give it. So if the problem that you're dealing with is how do we hire a good engineer, and you give it the data of every engineer you've had in the past decade who has had high marks, your AI may very well learn that all good engineers, falsely learn, I should say, that all good engineers are male, because that's who dominated engineers at your company for the last decade. So you've got to be careful about the data that goes in. There's an old computer saying, right, garbage in, garbage out. The thing with AI is people have so much faith in it that it has become more of garbage in, gospel out, that if the AI says it, it must be true. And so, that's just something to be cautious of. The second place, in addition to the sort of bad training data that AI sometimes runs into trouble, is that AI doesn't think about problems the way that we do. It has sort of a quirky intelligence of its own. And let me give you an example, if I may, and I think we have just enough time to do this, of what I mean by this. AI just focuses narrowly on the task at hand. It doesn't sort of solve it in the way that you might think to solve it. So there was an artificial intelligence, and it was trained in the laboratory to tell the difference between barnyard animals, horses, pigs, goats, you name it. And then they took it out to a video camera at a barn to see how it would do in the real world. And it did very well with all the animals, except that it couldn't detect a horse. And so the data scientists, took the AI back to the lab and said, why can't it tell a horse? And they looked at all the horse pictures that they used to train the AI, and they discovered that in the corner of those pictures, there was a little copyright symbol. So the AI learned that a copyright symbol is what a horse is, right? So it just doesn't necessarily think the way that we do when it solves the problems. And so these are the things to be aware of. In terms of actually filtering out bias, I would argue for sort of a two-step process. I would argue for human beings at step one to simply look at the different things that the AI is considering and see if any of those things, using their common sense, strike them as problematic. I was once talking to a vice president of fair lending at a major financial institution, and she told me some people had come to her with a better mousetrap. It was an AI product, and these people said, our AI product is really good at predicting who's going to pay back a mortgage. And she said, great, what features does it look at? And they said, well, it doesn't look at race or anything like that. And she said, that's great, because that would be a crime. And they said, well, she said, what does it look at? She said, it looks at other things, like how Republican is your neighborhood? Well, of course, that is really going to also be very much proxy for a number of characteristics of particular types of people, characteristics that you shouldn't consider. And that's something a human ought to spot right away if they're skilled in the area. So that's the first thing I always recommend, is just have someone who's sophisticated and sensitive look at the different things the AI is considering. And then the second thing I would say is you need to test it. You need to test it and see, and there are people who specialize in this, whether it's having a disproportionate impact on anyone who's a protected class or group. And if so, figure out why. Is there a good predictive reason for this? And even if there is a predictive reason, is there a less biased way, to get at the same result without having this disproportionate impact? So that's what I'd say about that, and let me turn it over.
Okay, thanks, Alex. We are getting almost to the top of the hour. Do want to at least get in one more question from the audience. So here's one I'll throw out to all of you. How are the panelists handling different media types and investigations where all data must be reviewed? Structured, unstructured, audio, video, example, financial services, trading desks, etc. Anybody want to kind of respond to that?
I would say one way that we would do it is sometimes what you do is you would build a separate model for each of the different data types. So you would do somewhat of an ensemble model sort of an approach, and different models may perform better on subsets of the data types. And another element of that as well would be stratified sampling. I think the question referenced that you have to review all the data, which is great, and you can still review all the data, but you can also do some stratified sampling to identify where your biggest risk pockets are, and then you can give those priority. So the model isn't so much It's not so much doing a sampling approach or making it so you don't have to put eyes on all the data or whatever it might be, but you can just identify those risk pockets and prioritize them a lot faster.
That makes perfect sense. So we were just past the top of the hour. I want to thank all the panelists for your great insights today. I want to thank all of you for joining, for CCBJ for hosting the webinar, and H5 for sponsoring. So thanks everybody for attending, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.